This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Morning, sir.
Yes, sir.
Acha. So today class we will be learning about the facial nerve. So facial nerve or the seventh cranial nerve is very closely, intimately related to the middle ear and also to the astral antrum. So knowledge regarding facial nerve is very essential as far as the ENT surgeon is concerned. So this is the overview of the facial nerve. You can see the facial nerve has it is a mixed nerve. It has a motor unit. It has a sensory unit, that is special sensation of taste carried through the cauda tympani nerve. Then it also serves as a secretomotor fibers supplying preganglionic parasympathetic fibers to the pterygopalatine ganglion to the otic ganglion, and from there you have the postganglionic fibers supplying the parotid gland, the different salivary glands also, and supplying also the minor salivary glands over the hard palate and soft palate. And the sensory part takes that is known as the nervous intermedius or nerve of Rishberg also you can say. And usually this facial nucleus lies on the floor of the fourth ventricle, and this and the fibers, they wind around the nucleus of the abducent nerve, which is over here, and forms a swell impression on the brain, that is usually the over the pons, and then that is called as the facial colliculus. And the sensory part comes from the nucleus, superior salivatory nucleus, and also the motor part comes from the nucleus of tractus solitarius. So the supranuclear pathway is comes via the corticobulbar tract, and then comes from the motor cortex area, broadband area 3 and 4. So mostly we will be concerned with the nuclear and then the infranuclear. So the facial nerve comes out through the pontomedullary junction and is closely accompanied by the vestibulocochlear nerve and traverses anteriorly and laterally towards the cerebello-pontine angle. So, and there what happens ki it enters into the uh, porus of the internal auditory meatus. So here you can see the ring-like thing. This signifies the fundus of the internal auditory meatus. So in between you have the intracranial part over here, which has the facial nucleus and then the fibers up to the uh, porus of the internal auditory meatus. So the internal auditory meatus roughly is 8 to 10 millimeter in length, and this from here as it enters the porus, it becomes intratemporal part and becomes extracranial. So the intratemporal part, the first part is that is the part in the internal auditory meatus. So it traverses the whole length of the internal auditory meatus, accompanied by the nervus intermedius and the vestibulocochlear nerve and the internal auditory artery. And then it exits the internal auditory meatus and forms the most thinnest part and the smallest part, that is the labyrinthine part. So the labyrinthine part is pretty thin, hardly 0.7 millimeter in diameter, and 4 millimeter in length. So, and then the labyrinthine part gives a very acute bend, and becomes the horizontal part or the tympanic part. This acute bend the air part is known as genu. Genu means the bend. So this first bend has the geniculate ganglion. So the geniculate ganglion here, the fibers from the which comes from the through the nerve of through the nervous intermediates, they don't relay here. They directly go in the greater superficial petrosal nerve. So you can see this is the greater superficial petrosal nerve, and here this is joined by another nerve, the deep petrosal nerve, to form the nerve of the pterygoid canal or Vidian nerve, and this Vidian nerve goes into the spinopalatine ganglion, which is formed by the maxillary nerve, and from here the postganglionic fibers, they supply the lacrimal gland. So this deep petrosal nerve is formed from the fibers coming from the tympanic plexus. So the tympanic plexus, is formed over the promontory. The tympanic plexus has both sympathetic and parasympathetic output. The sympathetic part comes from the carotico-tympanic plexus around the internal carotid artery, and then also the parasympathetic part comes via the tympanic branch of the ninth nerve, that is also known as the Jacobson's nerve. So this is a little bit of overview of the facial nerve. So it's a mixed nerve with motor, sensory, and secretomotor root. Nerve of the second branchial arch, and motor root supplies muscles of facial expression. And sensory root is otherwise known as nerve of Risper, and which supplies secretomotor fibers to lacrimal, submandibular, sublingual glands of the nose and palate, and also takes taste sensation from the anterior two-third of tongue, and also general sensation from concha and retroauricular skin. And the nucleus of the facial nerve, I told you, lies in the pons. So if you go back, see all these things you can see. This is the cauda tympani nerve. The taste sensation is carried out by the cauda tympani nerve. The cauda tympani nerve branches from the facial nerve about 3 to 4 millimeters. Here will be the stylomastoid foramen. So 3 to 4 millimeters above the stylomastoid foramen, the cauda tympani nerve branches and ascends, and then enters into the middle space via the posterior tympanic canaliculus, then traverses the whole uh, width of the middle ear space, going posterior to the neck of the malleus. So, and then passing and then exiting the middle, the tympanic cavity through the anterior tympanic canaliculus or the canal of Higuer. So then what happens? The cauda tympani nerve goes and joins the lingual nerve, and from the lingual nerve, this lingual nerve comes from the otic ganglion. So the otic ganglion, from the otic ganglion, the lingual nerve, the cauda tympani nerve joins the lingual nerve, and then supplies fibers to the submaxillary and sublingual glands, ganglion and also glands. So the facial nerve here is related to the spinopalatine ganglion, and via the lesser petrosal nerve is also related to the otic ganglion. So you have the lesser petrosal nerve which goes to the otic ganglion, and this otic ganglion, no, this is comes from the maxillary division, this comes from the mandibular division. So this is formed by the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. Okay. So here the mandibular division of trigeminal nerve, the the V3, and this is the maxillary division of the V2, and the V1 is the ophthalmic division of trigeminal. So motor fibers sweep around the nucleus of sixth cranial nerve and emerge at the lower border of pons, goes laterally and forward, we told, crosses the CT angle, enters the internal auditory meatus. So course intracranial, intratemporal and extracranial. So this is the, you can see this is the cross-sectional view. You can see this is the seventh nerve and forms a swelling that is in the fourth ventricle, floor of the fourth ventricle, that is called the facial colliculus. So here there nearby you have the spinal tract of the fifth nerve. The intratemporal course can be divided into meatal, labyrinthine, tympanic, mastoid. So meatal part already we have discussed, that is inside the internal auditory meatus, 8 to 10 millimeter in length. And then the labyrinthine part, I told you the thinnest and the shortest, around 0.6 millimeter, 0.6 to 0.7 millimeter in diameter and 4 mm in length. Then the tympanic part, which extends, starts just after the first genu and extends up to the second genu. And then from the second genu, you have the mastoid part. So the tympanic part is related to the medial wall of the middle ear, and the mastoid part is related to the posterior wall of the middle ear. So the tympanic part, among these four part, the dehiscence of fallopian canal incidence is very high in the tympanic part. So wherever you see a facial canal dehiscence, most likely it is in the tympanic part. And sorry, the tympanic part, the mastoid part is usually the part which is most commonly damaged during any mastoid surgery, like a modified radical mastoidectomy, or to some cases a cortical mastoidectomy also. Whereas now coming to the different branches, the greater superficial petrosal nerve is the first branch. Is the first branch given from the geniculate ganglion level. The next is the nerve to stapedius. Then you have the quadrant tympani. Then the nerve exits the stylomastoid foramen. Immediately after it exits the stylomastoid foramen, it gives three muscular branches: the posterior auricular nerve, branch to digastric, and styloid. Then after giving these three muscular branches, the nerve goes in an anterior course and then pierces the posterior border of the parotid, and then inside the parotid substance it divides into two main branches again, the zygomatico-temporal and the cervico-facial. So this after that they again divide into 5 terminal branches. So here the facial nerve divides the parotid into a superficial half and a deep part. So it is based on the position of the nerve. So the nerve lies in a plane that separates the superficial from the deep lobe of parotid. Now the surgical landmark, already I have told you regarding the functions, and the surgical landmark in middle ear and mastoid surgery is one of the most important and most constant surgical landmark is processus cochleariformis. So this is the one landmark which is even preserved in case of extensive cholesteatomas. So even extensive cholesteatoma also processus cochleariformis is usually spared, and the processus cochleariformis is a good surgical landmark for geniculate ganglion. Geniculate ganglion lies just medial to and just above the processus cochleariformis. Then you have the oval window and horizontal semicircular canal. The nerve passes in between the horizontal semicircular canal and the oval window. Then the short process of incus which is housed in fossa incudis, points in the direction of the facial nerve. So if you see the short proboscis, it is as if the short proboscis is pointing in the direction of the facial nerve. Then you have the pyramid. The pyramid is nothing. It houses the tendon of stapedius. The facial nerve goes just posterior to the pyramid. Then the tympanomastoid suture line. The tympanomastoid suture line you encounter when you are doing a canalplasty, or the moment you elevate the tympanomeatal flap, you can very nicely make out the tympanomastoid suture line. So the facial nerve lies 8 to 10 millimeter deep to the tympanomastoid suture line. So why the tympanomastoid suture line? Because when you are elevating the tympanomeatal flap, you will have some resistance here, because the flap is very tightly adherent to the tympanomastoid suture line. And then when elevating the flap, you have to be careful. And sometimes the tympanomastoid suture line may be very, very prominent. So in those conditions, you have to drill it out. So the tympanomastoid suture line, while drilling, you should be sure that the 8 to 10 millimeter below the tympanomastoid suture line lies your facial nerve. Then digastric ridge again is a very important landmark, particularly in case of parotid surgery. So the tympanomastoid suture line, the digastric ridge are also used during parotid surgery, and also you can use it in a mastoid surgery as well as in a parotid surgery. So when you are doing a cortical mastoidectomy now, and once you open the tip area and go on drilling the tip area, then you will have then you will come the digastric ridge will come. So digastric ridge separates the lateral tip cell from the medial tip cells, and as you press the digastric ridge anteriorly, it goes and meets the mastoid segment of the facial nerve. Parotid surgery, tragal pointer, styloid process, and posterior value of digastric. So tragal pointer is a very constant one. You just elevate, and the facial nerve lies 1 centimeter below and medial to the tragal pointer. Now, nerve injury may be a central, may be a peripheral cause. Central cause like brain abscess, Fontaine glioma, poliomyelitis, multiple sclerosis, or some vasculopathies. In the intracranial cerebellopontine angle, acoustic neuroma is a very common tumor which arises from the 8th cranial nerve. So the nerve name itself is suggestive: acoustic nerve, acoustic neuroma. Then you have meningioma, congenital cholesteatoma, and then meningitis, and also metastatic carcinoma deposits also can occur in the cerebellopontine angle. So these all can lead to facial nerve palsy. And the intratemporal part, congenital, is known as the Melchior-Rosenthal syndrome, and acquired is the Bell's palsy. And trauma, temporal bone fracture, post-surgical, particularly in most commonly seen in a canal wall down surgery, where you are not, you can, means the facial nerve, the level of the facial nerve could not be ascertained properly, and there might be injury to the facial nerve. And infective otitis media, usually suppurative otitis, acute suppurative otitis media can lead to facial nerve paralysis, but only in the setting of a dehiscent fallopian canal. If the fallopian canal is dehiscent, then otitis media with acute otitis, suppurative otitis media can lead to facial palsy. Then other are viral herpes zoster. We can some cases when you are doing a stapes surgery, mere handling of carotid, cauda tympani nerve can lead to release of this virus and leading to facial nerve palsy. Tubercular mastocytitis again, and malignant otitis externa, even other certain conditions like keratosis obturans of the external auditory canal can also really cause facial nerve palsy. And tumors like facial nerve neuroma, which causes recurrent facial nerve palsy, glomus jugulare, external and middle ear malignancy, and metastasis to temporal bone. In this condition also, you will get facial nerve palsy. So this is typical of you can see the vesicle erupting in the skin of the external auditory canal, classically seen in a Ramsay-Hunt syndrome. Intratemporal causes is birth trauma, why particularly when you're using a forceps delivery. So when you're applying the forceps, can lead to direct pressure over the facial nerve, because you know the facial nerve is quite superficial in case of children. Parotid surgery, very we take a consent actually, because if you are doing a superficial parotidectomy, you have to dissect the parotid tissue away from the facial nerve. So obviously a chance you might injure it. Surgery of temporomandibular joint, malignant tumors of parotid, and metastatic lymph nodes. So these all also can be facial nerve palsy. Systemic diseases like diabetes mellitus, hypothyroidism, uremia, polyarteritis nodosa, vaginous, and sarcoidosis also can lead to facial nerve palsy. Now, depending on the severity, the nerve injury can be classified into neuropraxia, which is the least to complete transection of the nerve. So neuropraxia is nothing but compression of exoplasm, and the nerve is viable and returns to normal function. So once the uh, pressure or whatever the pathology cease to act, there is flow of exoplasm again. Next is exotomesis, where compression persists with increase in the intraneural pressure. So, and then is the neurotomesis, where there is loss of myelin tube. Then partial transection, there is loss of myelin tube and disruption of perineurium. And complete transection is loss of myelin tube and disruption of perineurium and disruption of epineurium also. So if you take the nerve, no, it has three layers. The outermost layer is the epineurium, then you have the perineurium, and then you have the endoneurium. So a thin muscle fiber is covered by endoneurium. So the endoneurium is again covered by perineurium, and then perineurium is covered by epineurium. So these are the three layers. So the complete transection, I have told you the first three grades of injury can occur with viral inflammatory immune disorders such as a Bell's palsy. So you may have a neuropraxia, you may have exotomesis, and you can also get neurotomesis. So you can see here the normal nerve, and here it is compressed. The compression of the exoplasm flow will be inhibited for few time, and then once the compression compression is not there anymore, the flow again starts. So here there is a loss of the sheath, so this leads to takes time for the nerve to recover, and here there is total degeneration. So this will take a long time. It may not recover also. So in those cases, you may go for grafting. So here you can see this is a normal nerve. This is the epineurium, and this is the perineurium, and this is the endoneurium. So in grade 1, almost it looks normal. In grade 2, you can see there is a flow of the exoplasm is blocked, and there is no discontinuity. Here in grade 3, you see the epineurium is broken on one side, whereas the endoneurium and perineurium remain same. And this one is you can see where the epineurium is present, but the endoneurium and perineurium are lost. Here, sorry, here only the endoneurium is lost. So you can see the endoneurium is transected. This is the perineurium and this is the epineurium. They are constant. They are they are preserved. Whereas in grade 4, you have the epineurium and the perineurium are lost, whereas the what you say the the epineurium is preserved. The epineurium is preserved. The endoneurium and the perineurium is lost. So they are transected, and this is complete transection which involves the epineurium, and then you have the perineurium as well as the endoneurium. So first and second grade have excellent recovery, usually between 1 week to 2 months. So third grade recovery is moderate to poor. Fourth and fifth grade injuries are seen during surgery or temporal bone fracture, and in case of also malignant tumors. So both they never recover. Fourth grade rarely, but fifth never. So test for a topographical diagnosis, that is topographical means to say where the injury or most likely the pathology lies. So there are different tests. You see Skirmer's test, epidemial reflex test for taste sensation, and also for salivation. So Skirmer's test is what we do is we keep filter paper and we insert into the lower fornix of both the eyes and leave it for 15 minutes, and then you calculate the total length of the wet filter paper strip, and so then you compare the length of the wet filter paper between the two sides. Okay, so this tests the greater superficial petrosal nerve. So if the patient presents to you with what you say a Skirmer's test is positive, that indicates that the injury has occurred proximal to the geniculate ganglia. So either in the labyrinthine part or in the meatal part. Okay. The next is the stapedial reflex. The stapedial reflex, it's a protective reflex actually, and it is seen when the ear is exposed to a loud stimulus that is almost 85 to 90 decibel above the speech reception threshold. So what is speech reception threshold is there? A loud noise is presented to the patient, and then the patient has to tell whether he or she could hear the loud noise, and then taste salivation, taste sensation. Now this you can use the conventional method of keeping salt, sugar, and bitter, all these things, but it takes a lot of time. So and there occurs crossover also. It's not that if you divide the tongue into two half, it will remain as such. No. So and one taste may dominate over the other also. So here what they give is between individual taste, they keep 5 minutes gap. So in that 5 minutes, you can rinse your mouth and be prepared for the next. Or there is another method that is called the electrogustometry. So electrogustometry is where you use two pin to insert it into the thigh of the patient. So So taste sensation, you can keep the electrodes are pushed into the two part of the tongue. So you divide the tongue into two half and push the small electrodes, and you start to give current. And these are very in milliamperes, very small, and they won't give any cause any harm to the patient. So the moment you appreciate the metallic taste, you convey it to the person, and then they will note the amount of milliamperes of current required to elicit the uh, metallic taste. So they will do it on the other side. So a difference of more than 3.5 milliamperes indicates a pathology. And then test for salivation. So this what they do is they cannulate the Wharton duct or the Stenson duct and see for the amount of salivation. Then next is the electrodiagnostic test. So the electrodiagnostic, but these tests are now no longer used actually, but these are used now. The electrodiagnostic test. So minimal nerve excitability test, that is the nerve is stimulated at increased intensity till facial twitch is just noticed, and both sides are compared. If there is no difference, that indicates a conduction block. But if the difference exceeds more than 3 milliamperes, it indicates a degeneration. So you have to they are small needles. Either you can put it in the orbicularis oculi or orbicularis oris. These are muscles which are the occipital frontal belly of occipitofrontalis. So these are the muscles which are most commonly small needles are placed, and then you see the and then this test is carried out. Then minimal stimulation test is the current level to give the maximum facial movement. So at what stimulation you get the maximum facial movement, you compare with both the sides. And then you have the electroneuronography and you have the electromyography. So the electroneuronography is done after a week, after 3 to 4 days of facial injury, whereas electromyography you can do it immediately after facial injury. And the electroneuronography is a very good test which can tell whether the nerve can resolve spontaneously, or you have to go for a surgical intervention. Radiological test, CT and MRI can be done. So particularly in case of trauma to the temporal bone, you can do a very nicely. It can be seen with the help of a CT scan, and the CT scan also will help you to identify other areas where other areas which are also injured. MRI, a 4 Tesla MRI can very nicely identify the facial nerve. Sequelae of degeneration is you have a facial asymmetry, and then synkinesis leading to Frey syndrome, crocodile tear, clonic facial spasm, and ocular symptoms. So now coming to general management of facial nerve paralysis, in that line you have to do, and surgeries which are there for you is facial nerve decompression or end-to-end anastomosis and cable grafting. Now injection of botulinum is being done nowadays, tarsorrhaphy or gold implant, and electrical stimulation to prevent fibrosis and contracture of paralyzed muscle, and physiotherapy. So this botulinum and all, what they do is they can paralyze the opposite muscle. The botulinum is given intradermally to paralyze the muscle of the same muscle on the opposite side of face, so that you may have symmetry. So these are not dynamic, these are static surgery. That means at symmetry at rest will be there, but the moment the facial expression is there, no, you will have a asymmetry. So tarsorrhaphy and gold implant is like that, is used particularly for ptosis. Particularly to close the eye, because in case of facial nerve paralysis, no, the patient is unable to close the eyelid because of paralysis of orbicularis oculi muscle. So what they do, they keep a implant on the upper eyelid so that the weight of the implant will close the eye, and thereby also it prevents the development of complication in the eye like exposure keratitis and ulceration. So very important. Then electrical stimulation to prevent fibrosis and contracture, because you see the paralyzed muscle is left as such, no, so there will be diffuse atrophy, and there is no nerve, there is no stimulation to that muscle, so obviously slowly there will be fibrosis and contracture. So once that fibrosis and contracture develop, how much nerve grafting you do, it won't work out. So you have, if you are planning to do a grafting, nerve grafting, then you have to continue the stimulation. So these are given by our physiotherapy therapist over here. They give electrical stimulation, thereby preventing fibrosis and contraction. And this is the picture of facial palsy. You can see on the left side facial palsy, and on clenching the teeth, the angle of the mouth is deviated to the opposite side. Very clearly you can see that. And here you see the opposite angle is drooping down, and this is at a little higher level. And here on the so based on this facial paralysis, you can classify it into two broad categories, and the supranuclear and the infranuclear paralysis. The only gross difference you can make out is by observing the forehead. The forehead wrinkles will be, the forehead involvement will be spared in case of supranuclear paralysis, whereas it will be involved in infranuclear paralysis. So the features are starting from forehead here. You will, in case of a infranuclear, or most commonly the Bell's palsy, is loss of wrinkling on the forehead on the ipsilateral side. So the side there will be loss of wrinkling. When you ask the patient to frown, the patient, there will be total loss of wrinkling here. And number two is inadequate closure of the eye. Patient cannot close the eye, and whenever the patient tries to close the eye, the eyeball will rotate upwards. That is called as the Bell's phenomena. So in eye, you see that the patient cannot close the eye, and you will have what is called as the Bell's phenomena. And then you have deviation of the angle of mouth, loss of nasolabial fold on the affected side. The affected side angle also droops down. A patient will be unable to blow the cheek or retain the air in the mouth due to paralysis of the buccinator muscle. And whenever the patient tries to drink something, it trickles down through the opposite, because the patient is the water trickles down to the opposite side. And there will be difficult in also mastication, and food particles may get retained in the corners of the buccal cavity, that are leading to different problem. So Bell's palsy, the most common type, unknown etiology. So that is, otherwise it is also otherwise known as idiopathic facial nerve paralysis. So but the ischemic theory has been proposed, that is spasm of vasa nervosum, leading to ischemia of nerve, edema, and compression causing paralysis. The second is the viral theory. So explains the acuteness and self-limiting course of Bell's palsy, then autoimmune mechanism and hereditary due to a narrow fallopian canal. So among these, the ischemia theory is most accepted. Viral theory is also a few people give antiviral drugs in case of Bell's palsy. So clinical feature already we have gone through it. Loss of voluntary movement of facial expression on the side of lesion. Bell's phenomenon I have already told you. Inability to whistle or blow cheek. Facial asymmetry on clenching of teeth. Absence of wrinkling on forehead on affected side. Dry eye. Loss of taste sensation. Uh, intolerance to loud noise. This is due to a loss of dampening effect of the stapedius muscle. Then epiphora, the epiphora, why epiphora occurs? Because usually the lower lid, no, it holds the tear, and when there occurs paralysis of the orbicularis oculi, the lower lid loses its what you say tightness, and then it everts, and thereby leads to epiphora. So here the tears are collected here, and the lower lid which is functioning now, it holds the tear back normally, but in case of palsy the lid falls down and thereby the tear spills over. So that is called as the epiphora. Retroauricular pain to Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, inability to close the eyelid, and dribbling of saliva from angle of the mouth. This already we have discussed. So maximum weakness is attained by 48 hours. Differential diagnosis are other causes of facial nerve paralysis. So it can be diabetes, Melkerson, Rosenthal, Guillain-Barré, acoustic neuroma, Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, maybe case of cholesteatoma also. So treatment, it is divided into a general, medical, and surgical. General treatment consists of reassurance. If you are sure that it is a Bell's palsy, you give assurance to the patient that with treatment and give some time, most of the it will almost become near normal. So you assure the patient, and then give analgesics for ear pain if it is secondary to varicella zoster, and care of the eye is important. So care of the eye by giving instilling drops, methyl cellulose, and try and actively closing the eyelid means with your hand. You can use the patient, train the patient to use his or her hand to close the eyelid just before sleeping. Then physiotherapy is very, very important. And then medical treatment consists of steroids. So prednisolone is the drug of choice, 1 milligram per kg per day in 2 divided doses for 5 days. So, and patient is reviewed on 5th day. If it is recovering, you taper in 5 days. If there is no recovery, remains same, you continue for another 5 more days, and then taper it in the next 5 days. Antiviral drug you can use like acyclovir. Contraindications of using steroid and antiviral drug, particularly pregnancy, diabetes mellitus, hypertension. Particularly steroids, pregnancy, diabetes mellitus, hypertension, peptic ulcer, tuberculosis, and glaucoma. So these are the contraindications, but steroids should be given because it prevents synkinesis, crocodile tear, and shorten the recovery time. So prognosis, it's 85 to 90% you expect full recovery. So it's very, very important. Steroids is a very like a cornerstone in the treatment of facial nerve paralysis, particularly the Bell's palsy. But you have to rule out all these contraindications. So once the patient, you take a proper history and do some biochemical tests, and if these conditions are ruled out, you can go ahead with the steroids. So complications, maybe there might be incomplete recovery, and with some residual paralysis. Some cases you may get exposure keratitis, and then synkinesis. Synkinesis means when you ask the patient to do one function, and then all the muscles of other functions also get stimulated. Tics and spasm due to faulty regeneration, contracture, crocodile tears, Frey syndrome, that is gustatory sweating, and psychological problem of because face is everything now. So if a person has a facial nerve palsy and sees his or her face on the mirror every day, then there is likelihood that he or she might develop depression. So very, very important. We have to take into account that also. So the mind, this is the for Frey syndrome. The minor test, the start test showed areas where the secretions of sweat gland diluted with iodine, which reacted with the starch. So here you spill some starch, and then when it ask the patient to have food, and then you can make it out. This is Frey syndrome. Even it is seen as a complication of parotid surgery also. Surgery of the facial nerve, decompression, end-to-end anastomosis, and nerve grafting using cable graft. You can also do a facial hypoglossal, that is the ansa cervicalis with facial. You can in worst scenario you can use the ansa hypoglossal nerve and anastomose with the facial nerve also. So this is in short regarding the facial nerve. As far as your undergraduate level is concerned, I think this is more than enough for you. Any doubt? Hello, can you hear?
Yes.
Hello,
No
any
doubt.
doubt you have, you can ask.
No, sir.
No doubt.
No, sir.
Just hold on. Let me save your attendance.